go from the A to Z, as I mentioned, including things like athletics, sports. We have been a significant presence in something like pro football, even though this story hasn't really been told. Latinos have been a significant presence in the shaping of something like, even like the NFL, believe it or not. We go back to people like Joe Kapp, who got a basketball scholarship, went into Cal Berkeley, then went on to play with the Vikings. People like Jim Plunkett, Tom Flores, all the way up to today with Tony Romo playing for the Cowboys, and Mark Sanchez, who was a quarterback for the Jets. Of course, on the other side, we have lots of cultural phenomena coming from bigger cultural producers, entities like DC and Marvel. In the 70s, we started seeing comic books where Latino superheroes were centrally figured in those worlds. If we count them to today, we can approximate about 50 to 60 Latino superheroes. That doesn't include the villains in the DC and Marvel comic book worlds. Why? Again, we have to go back to this very foundational concept based on the reality of the way the demographics of Latinos have become very much a main part of the reality that we see, that we taste, that we hear, that we feel with all of our senses here in the United States of America. And so when you have creators, creative minds who decide to create, to make cultural objects, those cultural objects are increasingly inclusive of Latinos. Why? Because Latinos are the reality of the United States, very much. When we see the non-inclusion of Latinos in cultural phenomena, in cultural products, it's especially increasingly becoming something quite egregious, even shameful, right? Because people look at the reality and then they look at what's being made and wonder why we're not present. I use a good example, the film Thor that came out a couple of years ago, where it's clearly set in the Southwest, but there are no Latinos in that movie. They've been extracted, actually. Kenneth Branagh, the director, took out all the scenes that had Latinos in the original filming of that cultural object that was created and put out there. And many of us scratch our heads when we see a movie like that because it's so clearly an extraction and deletion and erasure, and therefore an irresponsible maneuver, an irresponsible move on the part of the director to not have us as a part of that representation. Going back to comic books, and I'm going to give us a widespread here just so that we can really understand the important presence of Latino culture and Latino culture as actually mainstream culture, right? Our presence as interpreters, as shapers of mainstream. Going back to the 70s, as I mentioned, we had DC and Marvel starting to create characters. One of them was a character named Vibe for the Justice League of America, for DC. And of course, in those early days, what we really saw was a distillation and recreation of Latinos that followed stereotypes, very lazy way of imagining, recreating, and putting out there for people Latinos in culture. So you have someone called Paco Ramon, who is a breakdance superhero. He has his superpowers are contained in his ability to breakdance. And in the first issue, one of his battles is against an African-American villain called Crowbar. Of course, what we're seeing pretty typically is this move on the part of what we can call a mainstream culture that's being rather formulaic and lazy, reproducing this African-American versus Latino, but also a Latino who speaks in truncated English, very heavily accented, and so on and so forth. Another character that comes to mind in the 80s is Firebird that Marvel put out, And she's actually a little bit more interesting. She's a social worker by day. She's from the Southwest, and when she turns into Firebird as a superheroine, she goes and helps basically fight the evildoers. In the end, though, what we still see in these early comic book iterations on the part of the big mainstream is, so people like Firebird coming along, doing her work, and then the Anglo superheroes coming at the end of the comic book and taking all the credit. So you either see them appearing as very stereotypical in the sense of this very heavily accented Spanish, or as the kind of janitors of the Marvel and DC worlds. Today we're seeing a huge proliferation. We've seen a huge proliferation of comic book superheroes where the DC and Marvel creators are bringing what I call in my work and in my lectures a greater will to style. That is, a willfulness in how they distill and recreate our reality into a cultural product that is responsible not just to technique and form, but also to content, and a content where the reality is much more Latino, a content that is much more Latino. So with characters like Blue Beetle, the new vibe, Blue Beetle as Jaime Reyes from Texas, we have the new vibe character who is no longer called Paco as he was in the early iteration with Justice League, who's called Cisco now. We have characters like Araña, White Tiger, Latina superheroes that are extremely fierce, strong, athletic, but also very smart. We also have Miss America Chavez, the new Nova, and a Latino that is black and Latino, or African American and Latino, Spider-Man with Miles Morales in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics series. Here what we start to see is, in fact, this great presence of a will to style that's responsible to the fact that we, as a Latino population, are very much the mainstream in our presence, in our shaping, in our interpreting, in our producing of cultural phenomena, and at the same time, a great will to style in technique, in story. Very fleshed out characters, very interesting visuals, to move the story along.